The feverish bride clutched a tiny brass key so tightly that even unconscious, she refused to let anyone take it. What secret was she carrying across the west? A lantern rattled against the wall as Wade Turner pushed through the cabin door with the unconscious woman in his arms. Snowmelt dripped from his boots onto the floorboards. Her suitcase had burst open at the station, but one thing never left her grasp: a brass key pressed deep into her palm. Then, in the middle of a fever dream, she whispered 4 words that made Wade stop cold. What do you think she was running from? Share your thoughts below. Late in the fall of 1889, the eastbound train groaned to a stop beside the small platform at Dry Fork, Wyoming Territory. A cold wind swept across the tracks and carried dust through the waiting crowd. Ranch hands pulled their coats tighter. A freight wagon rattled past the general store. Somewhere down the street, a blacksmith's hammer rang against iron. Most folks were waiting for mail. No one was waiting for the woman who stepped off the last passenger car. She was young, dark-skinned, thin from travel. A small brown suitcase hung from one hand. For a moment she stood perfectly still. Then her knees gave way. The suitcase struck the platform first. She followed. A sharp gasp rippled through the crowd. The station master hurried forward, then stopped halfway. "Lord above," somebody muttered. The woman didn't move. Her face was pale beneath the fever burning through her. Damp strands of hair clung to her forehead. Her breathing came in shallow bursts. A man near the ticket office pulled his young son closer. "Stay back." Others followed his lead. No one knelt beside her. No one touched her. The wind rolled across the platform again. Then another figure stepped out from the edge of the crowd. Wade Turner, 41 years old, horse rancher, widower. A man better known for keeping to himself than joining any conversation. He looked down at the unconscious woman for only a second. Then he shrugged out of his heavy coat and laid it over her shoulders. "She needs a doctor," someone said. "Doctor's 2 towns away," another answered. Wade crouched beside her. Her skin felt hot enough to burn through his calloused hand. Fever. Bad one. Without asking permission from anyone, he slipped an arm beneath her shoulders and another beneath her knees. The woman weighed almost nothing. A few people stared. One woman opened her mouth as if she meant to object. Wade never looked at her. He carried the stranger across the street toward his wagon. The suitcase had burst open when it hit the platform. A dress, a comb, a pair of gloves. Not much else. Wade bent to gather the belongings. As he reached for the last item, he paused. A small leather-bound ledger. Old. Locked. He picked it up carefully. The woman stirred weakly. Even unconscious, her fingers searched for something. Only then did Wade notice the tiny brass key clenched tightly in her hand. He slipped the ledger back into the suitcase and climbed onto the wagon bench. The horses started forward. Dry Fork slowly disappeared behind them. The road to Broken Pine Ranch wound north beneath the shadow of Windstone Ridge. The sky darkened early. Thin clouds drifted over the mountains. Frost already covered patches of grass along the fence lines. Halfway home, the woman began to tremble beneath the coat. Wade guided the wagon faster. By the time the ranch house came into view, night had settled over the valley. He carried her inside, placed her carefully on the spare bed, lit a lamp, fetched water. The fever never broke. Hours passed. The ranch grew silent except for the crackle of firewood in the stove. Near midnight, Wade sat beside the bed changing a damp cloth across her forehead. Suddenly the woman spoke. Not loudly, barely more than a whisper. Her eyes never opened. "Please," the word drifted through the room. Wade looked up. A moment later it came again. "Don't let him find me." Her hand tightened around the little brass key. "Please, don't let him find me." The fire popped softly in the stove. Outside, the Wyoming wind rattled the porch railing. Wade stared at the stranger lying in the bed, at the fever, at the key, at the locked ledger resting on the table nearby. And for the first time since meeting her, he understood something. This woman hadn't only arrived sick, she had arrived running from someone. The thought stayed with Wade Turner long after midnight. The fire in the stove burned low. Wind scraped against the cabin walls. Outside, Broken Pine Ranch sat quiet beneath a hard Wyoming sky. Inside, Ruby Harper drifted in and out of fever dreams. Sometimes she whispered words Wade couldn't understand. Sometimes she called for someone. Sometimes she simply stared at the ceiling without seeing it. By dawn, her fever had climbed higher. Wade saddled his horse before sunrise. The nearest doctor lived more than 10 miles away near Cotton Creek. The ride there took over an hour through frozen ruts and narrow trails winding beneath Windstone Ridge. The doctor couldn't leave. Too many patients. Too much snow coming. Instead, he handed Wade a packet of willow bark powder, a bottle of tonic, and instructions scribbled on the back of an old receipt. Wade folded the paper carefully into his coat pocket. Then he rode home. The first snowstorm of the season arrived that afternoon. Heavy clouds rolled over the mountains. By evening, white flakes covered the ranch fences. Ruby's fever still hadn't broken. For 3 nights, Wade barely slept. He boiled water, changed cloths, measured medicine, kept fresh wood in the stove. Twice he woke to find her trying to stand. Both times her legs failed before she reached the door. "You need to stay in bed," he told her. She looked confused, as if she didn't know where she was, as if she expected someone else entirely. The 4th day brought deeper snow. A neighbor rode by with news. The annual horse sale in Dry Fork would take place in 2 days. Wade had planned for months. 3 young horses were ready. The sale could determine whether the ranch finished winter comfortably or struggled through spring. The neighbor leaned against the gate. "You coming?" Wade looked toward the cabin window. A lamp still glowed beside Ruby's bed. "I don't know." The man followed his gaze, then nodded once. "Fair enough." No more was said. By the 6th day, the storm finally weakened. Sunlight appeared between drifting clouds. Inside the cabin, the fever began to loosen its grip. Late that afternoon, Ruby opened her eyes and stayed awake. For the first time. She stared at the unfamiliar ceiling, the rough pine walls, the iron stove, the folded blanket across her legs. Then she noticed Wade asleep in a wooden chair beside the bed. His head leaned back against the wall, one arm folded across his chest. His boots were still coated with dried snow and mud. The lamp beside him had burned almost empty. Ruby watched him quietly. A stranger. Yet he had stayed. Her gaze drifted toward the table. Her suitcase sat unopened. The locked ledger remained exactly where she remembered placing it. The brass key was still tied safely inside a ribbon around her wrist. Nothing had been touched. Nothing taken. A small detail. But it mattered. More than Wade could know. A floorboard creaked. Wade opened his eyes immediately. Years of ranch life had trained him well. For a second he looked disoriented. Then he saw her watching him. "You awake?" His voice sounded rough from lack of sleep. Ruby nodded. "You've been out nearly a week." She swallowed. Her throat hurt. "Did I—" She stopped. Wade poured water into a tin cup. "You had a fever." He handed it to her. She accepted it carefully. Their fingers brushed for a moment. Neither reacted. "You brought me here." "I did." "Why?" The question came before she could stop it. Wade looked toward the stove, as if the answer should have been obvious. You needed help, Ruby lowered her eyes. Nobody had said those words to her in a very long time. The following days settled into a quiet routine. Snow remained along the fence lines. The horses needed feeding before dawn. Water barrels froze overnight. The ranch moved according to weather, chores, and daylight. Slowly, Ruby recovered. She spent mornings near the kitchen table wrapped in a blanket. By the second week, she began helping. At first, it was small things: sorting receipts, counting feed invoices, organizing supply orders. One afternoon, Wade returned from the barn carrying a stack of account books. Ruby glanced through them while drinking coffee. 5 minutes later, she looked up. You're paying twice for oats. Wade frowned. No. You are. She showed him 2 nearly identical receipts. Different dates, same delivery, same amount. Wade studied the papers, then laughed quietly. I'll be damned. The sound surprised both of them. Ruby smiled before she could stop herself. It was the first real smile he had seen from her, and the first genuine laugh he'd allowed himself in years. The days grew easier after that. Not because either of them talked much, but because silence no longer felt uncomfortable. One evening, Ruby carried folded laundry past a half-open door. She stopped. A photograph rested on a shelf. A woman, young, beautiful, standing beside a younger Wade. The picture had been handled so many times the corners had worn smooth. Ruby looked away immediately. She hadn't meant to see it, but she understood. Some losses never left a house. They simply learned where to sit. Later that night, Wade found the photograph slightly out of place. His eyes moved toward Ruby. She said nothing. Neither did he. Yet something passed between them. An understanding. No explanations needed. The next morning, sunlight broke through clear skies for the first time in days. Ruby stood on the porch holding a mug of coffee. The valley below Windstone Ridge shimmered beneath fresh snow. For a moment, the world felt peaceful, almost new. Then she heard hoofbeats. A rider approached through the ranch gate. Wade stepped outside. The rider handed him an envelope. Kansas City was stamped across the front. Wade glanced at the handwriting. His expression changed immediately. Not fear, not anger. Something colder, more cautious. Ruby watched from the porch. Wade opened the letter, read one line, then another. The winter wind moved through the yard. Neither spoke. Finally, Ruby saw the signature at the bottom. Everett Sloan. And somehow, before anyone said a word, she knew her past had found her. The letter remained in Wade's hand for several seconds. The winter sun hung low over Broken Pine Ranch. Snow glimmered along the fence rails. Somewhere beyond the barn, a horse stamped its hoof against frozen ground. Ruby stood on the porch holding her coffee cup. She already knew that name. She had spent months trying to forget it. Wade folded the letter once and slipped it into his coat pocket. Neither of them spoke. Not right away. Finally, he looked at her. You know him. It wasn't a question. Ruby lowered her eyes. Yes. The wind moved a loose strand of hair across her face. She didn't brush it away. For a long moment, Wade simply waited. He had never been a man who forced words from people. He worked with the charity foundation where I kept records, Ruby said quietly. That's all? No, the answer came almost as a whisper. Wade nodded once. That was enough for now. 3 days later, Everett Sloan arrived in Dry Fork. News traveled fast in small western towns. By supper, half the town knew a lawyer from Kansas City had come looking for Ruby Harper. By sunrise, the other half knew as well. Everett dressed like a man who belonged somewhere larger than Wyoming. His coat was expensive. His boots carried almost no dust. His smile never quite reached his eyes. He began at the bank, then the general store, then the hotel dining room. Everywhere he went, he told the same story. A woman named Ruby Harper had stolen money. A woman named Ruby Harper had fled Kansas City. A woman named Ruby Harper had escaped before justice could catch her. He carried papers, official-looking papers, letters, statements, names, the kind of documents that made people uncomfortable, the kind most folks never questioned. Within days, the atmosphere around Dry Fork changed, not dramatically, just enough. People still nodded to Wade, but slower, more cautiously. At Martha Reed's sewing shop, conversations stopped when Ruby entered. At the Mercantile, two women studying fabric lowered their voices. One afternoon, Ruby reached the counter to purchase thread. The clerk avoided her eyes while counting change. The coins felt colder than usual in her hand. When she stepped back outside, snow drifted lazily through the air. She stood for a moment beneath the awning, pretending not to notice, pretending it didn't hurt. But some wounds remembered their shape. Back at the ranch, Wade found her staring out the kitchen window. The coffee pot sat untouched. The room felt quieter than usual. "How bad is it?" he asked. Ruby didn't turn around. "Bad enough." Neither spoke after that. The silence between them wasn't angry, just tired. A few days later, another problem arrived. Harold Finch from the Dry Fork Bank rode out personally. He carried a leather folder beneath his arm. Wade met him near the barn. Ruby watched from the porch. Finch cleared his throat. "The extension request has been denied." Wade frowned. "Since when?" "Since this morning." Finch looked uncomfortable. "Bank doesn't want unnecessary risk." Wade understood immediately. "Everett Sloan." Finch didn't answer, which was answer enough. The banker mounted his horse and left. The sound of hoofbeats faded down the frozen road. That evening, Wade sat alone reviewing account books. The loan mattered. So did the horse contracts. A canceled agreement could damage the ranch badly before spring. Yet somehow, that wasn't what bothered him most. Inside the house, Ruby folded laundry. Every movement seemed careful, measured, as if she were already preparing herself to leave. 3 mornings later, a horse trader canceled a purchase order. No explanation. Just a short note. Wade crumpled it once, then smoothed it flat again. Anger never solved much on a ranch. By then, Dry Fork had already made up its mind, or at least most of it had. The final blow came when Harold Finch announced publicly that Broken Pine Ranch was sheltering a fraud. The statement spread through town before sunset. Ruby heard about it from Martha Reed. The older widow looked embarrassed while delivering the news. "I'm sorry, honey." Ruby managed a small smile. "It isn't your fault." That night, she packed her suitcase. The same suitcase she had carried from Kansas City. The same suitcase she had carried off the train before collapsing. She folded her dresses carefully, wrapped the ledger inside a blanket, placed the brass key in her pocket. Then she closed the case. Outside, moonlight covered the ranch in silver. Inside, Wade sat alone beside the horse barn. Hours passed. He never came inside, never asked her to stay, never asked her to leave. He simply sat there, watching the lantern sway gently from a post, listening to the winter wind. By dawn, Ruby understood. He wasn't giving up. He was giving her dignity. The next morning, she carried the suitcase onto the porch. The wagon stood ready. A stagecoach would leave Dry Fork before noon. Wade walked toward her. Something rested in his hand. A train ticket. He held it out. Ruby stared at it. confused. "If you're leaving," he said quietly, "you'll need this." The ticket trembled slightly between her fingers. Not from cold, from everything else. Wade looked toward Windstone Ridge, then back at her. "If you go, go because you want to." His voice stayed calm, steady. "Don't go because they want you to." For several seconds, Ruby couldn't speak. The tears arrived before words did. The first tears since she had stepped off that train. She lowered her head, tried to hide them, failed. Wade pretended not to notice, giving her that dignity too. A long minute passed. Then Ruby folded the ticket, carefully, slowly, and placed it back in his hand. "I'm staying." The words barely left her mouth before another sound echoed across the yard. Hoofbeats, fast, purposeful. Both turned. Sheriff Ben Calloway rode through the ranch gate. His expression told them everything before he dismounted. The sheriff removed his hat, looked at Ruby, then at Wade. Finally, he unfolded a document from inside his coat. "I'm sorry," he said. The paper shook slightly in the wind. "I have a temporary detention order." The world seemed to stop moving. Even the horses had gone quiet. And for the second time since arriving in Wyoming, Ruby felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. Sheriff Ben Calloway removed his gloves slowly and folded the detention order. "I don't have a choice," he said. "The judge agreed to hear the matter tomorrow morning." The winter air hung cold between them. Wade stepped forward. "She's not running. I know that." "Then why bring papers?" Ben looked tired. Because he'd spent the entire week listening to Everett Sloan. Because half the town wanted answers. Because the law rarely moved as fast as rumors. "I'll treat her fairly," he said quietly. Ruby set her suitcase back down beside the porch steps. The same suitcase she had packed less than an hour earlier. The same one she had planned to carry away forever. Instead, she turned toward the sheriff. "I'll come." Wade looked at her immediately. She gave the smallest shake of her head. No argument, no scene, only dignity. The ride into Dry Fork took nearly an hour. Snow rested along the road shoulders. Thin smoke drifted from chimneys. A church bell rang somewhere beyond Main Street. The sheriff's office stood beside the feed store, a plain wooden building with 2 small cells in back. Ruby wasn't locked behind bars. Ben gave her a narrow room with a bed, a wash basin, and a window overlooking the street. Still, a closed door felt like a closed door. The town noticed. By sunset, people gathered outside the hotel and talked in low voices. Some believed Everett, others weren't sure. Very few spoke up for Ruby. Only Martha Reed arrived carrying a basket, fresh bread, a jar of preserves, and a wool blanket. "You'll need this tonight," the widow said. Ruby thanked her softly. After Martha left, Wade remained. He stood across the street beneath the awning of the Mercantile. Hour after hour, snow drifted around his boots. The sheriff finally stepped outside. "You can go home." Wade never moved. "I'm staying." Ben glanced toward the window where Ruby sat. Then he nodded. By morning, nearly everyone in Dry Fork had heard about the hearing. The town hall filled early. Ranchers, shop owners, railroad workers, church members, people who had never spoken to Ruby, people who suddenly had opinions about her. Ruby sat alone at a small table near the front. Her hands rested quietly in her lap. Across the room, Everett Sloan arranged his papers. His confidence seemed untouched. When the hearing began, he spoke first. His voice carried easily through the hall. He presented financial statements, letters, signed accusations, witness statements from Kansas City. Each document seemed to point toward one conclusion. Ruby Harper had stolen money. As the evidence piled up, whispers spread through the room. Ruby stopped looking at the crowd, stopped looking at the judge. Eventually, she looked only at her hands, the same hands that had balanced ledgers, the same hands that had worked honestly for years. Strangely, she felt tired more than frightened, tired of defending herself, tired of proving she deserved to be believed. Then a voice rose from the back of the room. "Those papers don't tell the whole story." Heads turned. An elderly man stepped forward carrying a worn Bible beneath one arm. "Pastor Elijah Moore." The room fell silent. Everett's smile disappeared for the first time. The pastor looked directly at him. "I remember you." A flicker of concern crossed Everett's face. Pastor Moore continued, "I worked with that charity foundation for 12 years. The judge leaned forward. "And?" The pastor pointed toward Ruby. "She didn't steal from that foundation." Then he pointed toward Everett. "He did." The room erupted. Everett stood abruptly. "That's ridiculous." But Pastor Moore wasn't finished. He described missing funds, false entries, altered reports, and one employee who discovered the truth. Ruby Harper. A stunned silence followed. Then Wade stood, without saying a word, without asking permission. He walked to Ruby's table, set something in front of the judge, the locked ledger. Ruby stared. Slowly she removed the brass key from her pocket, the same key she had protected since the day she arrived. The lock clicked open. Inside were names, amounts, dates, signatures, every missing dollar carefully recorded, every false payment documented, every lie exposed. The judge turned page after page. The room grew quieter with each one. For the first time all morning, Everett Sloan looked afraid, and Ruby finally lifted her eyes. The silence inside the town hall felt heavier than the snow outside. Judge Harlan Whitaker turned another page of the ledger, then another. His expression grew harder with each entry. Names, dates, amounts, withdrawals that had never reached the children the charity claimed to serve, payments signed by people who did not exist. The room remained still except for the turning of paper. Everett cleared his throat. Those records proved nothing. No one answered him. Pastor Elijah Moore stood quietly near the back row. Sheriff Ben Calloway folded his arms. Wade never took his eyes off Ruby. At last the judge closed the ledger. The sound echoed through the room. "Miss Harper is cleared of every accusation." A murmur swept across the hall. The judge looked directly at Everett. "As for you, Mr. Sloan, I suggest you prepare yourself for a much different conversation." Everett's face drained of color. Sheriff Ben stepped forward. The lawyer looked around the room as if searching for someone willing to help him. Nobody moved. Before Ben escorted him away, Everett stopped. His gaze settled on Wade, then on Ruby. A strange smile crossed his face. "You think you know her?" The room fell silent again. "You only know half the story." Then he was gone. The door closed behind him, and yet his final words remained, like smoke that refused to leave a room. Outside, sunlight reflected off fresh snow. People who had doubted Ruby suddenly found reasons to be elsewhere. Some offered awkward apologies. Others simply lowered their eyes. Martha Reed crossed the street and hugged Ruby without saying a word. The gesture nearly broke her. For weeks, she had carried herself like someone balancing a glass bowl that might shatter at any moment. Now, for the first time, she could breathe. That evening, Wade drove the wagon home. Neither spoke much. The horses followed the familiar road through the valley. Windstone Ridge glowed gold beneath the setting sun. Ruby sat beside him on the bench seat. Her gloves rested in her lap. The cleared accusations should have felt like an ending. Instead, Everett's final words lingered. Wade seemed to feel it too. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Coffee simmered on the stove. Frost covered the window corners. Ruby sat at the kitchen table while Wade repaired a leather bridle strap. Finally, he set the tool down. Was he right? Ruby looked up. For a moment, neither moved. Then she nodded. Partly. Wade waited. Years around horses had taught him patience. Ruby folded her hands. There was a man before all of this. The fire crackled softly. He was wealthy, connected, the kind of man who thought money solved every problem. She stared toward the window. He asked me to marry him. Wade remained silent. I said no. The words seemed smaller now than they had years ago, but he wasn't used to hearing that answer. Snow slid from the roof outside. A dull thump, then quiet again. He and Everett worked together. After I refused him, rumors started, then accusations, then the missing money. Ruby lowered her eyes. They couldn't control my decision, so they tried to destroy my reputation. For several seconds, Wade said nothing. Not because he was angry, not because he doubted her. He simply needed a moment. Finally, he stood. Come with me. Ruby blinked. Where? You'll see. They saddled 2 horses and rode east. The trail climbed gradually toward a ridge overlooking the valley. Broken Pine Ranch grew smaller below them. Snow rested in shaded places beneath the pines. By afternoon, they reached the overlook. The entire Windstone Valley stretched beneath a pale blue sky. Ruby had never seen it from this angle. The ranch, the creek, the distant church steeple in Dry Fork. Everything looked different. Wade dismounted first, then helped her down. He led her a short distance along the ridge. There, tucked between a stand of pines, stood a small, unfinished house. Fresh timber, a stone chimney, new windows. Ruby stared. I don't understand. Wade reached into his coat pocket. He held out a key. Not a ring, not flowers, just a key, the kind a person carried every day. I started building this 2 years ago. Ruby looked from the key to the house. I thought it would be enough for 2 people. The winter breeze lifted a strand of her hair. Wade smiled faintly. Turns out I was wrong. She frowned slightly. Then Wade stepped closer. Very gently, he rested his hand against her stomach. Ruby froze. The realization came all at once. The recent exhaustion, the mornings she felt dizzy, the changes she had blamed on stress. Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. Wade's voice remained quiet. I think this house was built for 3. Ruby laughed and cried at the same time. The sound carried into the cold air. For a long moment, neither spoke. They simply stood there overlooking the valley. A man who had spent years alone, a woman who had spent years running. Neither had expected this ending. Yet somehow it had found them. The following spring arrived slowly. Snow melted from the hillsides. Wildflowers returned. Foals ran through the pastures behind Broken Pine Ranch. Beside the church in Dry Fork, a small schoolhouse opened its doors. Ruby taught reading, writing, and arithmetic to local children. Wade trained horses and repaired fences. Life settled into ordinary routines, the best kind. One warm afternoon, laughter drifted across the porch of their home. A baby's laughter. Ruby looked up from her lesson papers. Wade stood near the fence holding their son. The same man who once sat alone beside a barn all night now smiled more easily than he realized. The valley stretched wide behind them, green instead of white, alive instead of frozen. Ruby remembered stepping off the train months earlier. Weak, feverish, terrified. She had arrived carrying a suitcase and a secret. She never imagined she would find a home. Yet there it was, not in a building, not in a town, but in the people waiting for her each evening when the day was done. The wind moved softly through the pines. The child laughed again. And beneath the endless Wyoming sky, the long journey that had begun in fear finally came to rest in love. Sometimes I think that's why stories like this stay with us long after they're over. Not because of the courtroom, not because of the accusations, not even because the truth finally came to light. They stay with us because, at some point, we've all carried something heavy. A mistake we didn't make. A wound we didn't deserve. A season when it felt easier to keep walking than to trust another soul. And if you place yourself where Ruby once stood, stepping off a train with nowhere left to go, unsure who to trust, you begin to understand how powerful a second chance can be. Not the kind offered by luck, but the kind offered by a person who chooses kindness when suspicion would be easier. Maybe that's the quiet lesson hidden in this story. Healing rarely arrives all at once. Sometimes it comes through a warm cup of coffee left on a table, a light left burning in the window, a hand that stays when the world gives you reasons to leave. And sometimes love begins not with grand promises, but with someone simply refusing to let you face a storm alone. If this story brought someone to mind, or reminded you of a season in your own life, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. And if you'd like to spend more evenings with stories of courage, redemption, mystery, and hearts finding their way home, you're warmly invited to join us again. There are many more trails ahead, and somewhere beyond the next horizon, another unforgettable story is waiting.